Hello everyone and welcome to StudyIQ. Today we have with us a very special guest, one of the noted economists of our times, Shri Bibek Debroy. Shri Bibek Debroy, sir, welcome to StudyIQ.
Thank you.
Sir, Mr. Debroy is the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister currently. He has been a member of the NITI Aayog since its inception in 2015, and he was a member for a very long time. Most of you who are UPSC aspirants would know him via the railway restructuring committee that he chaired and the reforms that he suggested that you all have to remember. And today we are going to talk with him about the various economic affairs of the country, as well as something else that he's doing apart from being an economist. So sir, my first question to you today would be regarding your work on the translation of ancient texts. Now you are an economist, so how did you come about to translate ancient texts like Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita and some other books that you have been doing over the past 15 years?
This is a question that does not have a very simple answer, because it is not as if suddenly overnight I decided that I was going to do it from tomorrow. This has been a period of transition. There have been various triggers. One trigger, and it's not the only trigger, but one trigger that I've mentioned in the past is I read a shloka from the Valmiki Ramayana, which because of constraints of time, I will not repeat. And more or less at the same time, I read a shloka from Kalidasa's Meghadutam. And I thought, if I do not read this literature, and I'm using the word literature for the moment, I will have lost out on something in life. So my initial interest, and I should state very clearly that I have no formal training in Sanskrit. So far as Sanskrit is concerned, I am self-taught. My proficiency in Sanskrit is over the last 15 years or so, an acquired one. When I began to read these texts, initially purely from an intellectual point of view of reading them, I realized that the particular texts I am interested in, namely what is known as Itihasa and Purana, these are texts for which no unabridged translations are typically available in English. Yes, there are translations in other languages, but increasingly there is a generation which is more and more familiar with English. So Itihasa, in this particular case, means the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And Puranas, of course, mean the 18 Mahapuranas. Most Indians have a familiarity with the stories in Itihasa and Purana, but those are based on abridged versions. Reading and watching dumbed down versions, and therefore we miss out on a wealth of information that is available in these texts. For example, you may be surprised to know, and whenever I use the word translation, I mean in English, you may be surprised to know that as of today, there are only 3 unabridged translations of the Mahabharata. It is not as if there are a countless number of translations floating around. The ones you see are abridged. They miss out on the nuances. For the Valmiki Ramayana, number of unabridged translations in English is 5. For the Bhagavata Puran, 5. For the Markandeya Puran, 3. For the Matsya Puran, 0. Here is a corpus we are not even familiar with. And when you go into this corpus, you realize it is not just about stories. Beautiful poetry, wealth of geographical information, a template of governance, our history, the norms of not just moksha dharma, which is liberation and emancipation, but what householders are supposed to do in their everyday tasks. Had it been the case that people who are proficient in Sanskrit, those who are Sanskrit academics, had they translated all of this, I don't think an economist would have stepped into the vacuum. But because there was a vacuum, I decided to translate them. So far as what I have done so far, I have done the Mahabharata, the Valmiki Ramayana, I have done the Harivansha, which is not quite a Puran, it is regarded as a sequel to the Mahabharata. I have done the Bhagavad Puran and the Markandeya Puran to give you some idea of the size. All of these, what I have just described in English, comes to about 4.5 million words. I have done the Vishnu Puran and the Brahma Puran, which are yet to be published because of COVID, publications are on hold. All the 18 Mahapuranas taken together will be 12 million words. So that's why I'm doing this. Simple, brief answer.
And for our viewers, I just want to inform you that one of those 3 unabridged versions of the Mahabharata that are around, one of those 3 has been translated by Shri Bibek Debroy. So, sir, my next question is regarding these ancient texts. You have been translating them to English so that the modern generation can read them. It is easier for them to grasp them. But do you think that these millennia old texts hold any practical value today to the youth of the country?
How do you know whether they hold value or not if you do not read them? I can decide they have no value once I have read them. The National Manuscript Mission, Namami, there's something called a National Manuscript Mission. A manuscript is defined as something that is more than 75 years old. Namami's task is to collate, initially just list all the manuscripts that are available in India in private and public collections. So far, Namami has listed about 3.5 million. Estimate is there are at least 38 million manuscripts in the country. How many books have been published in any language in the world since Gutenberg's printing press? The UN has a figure, which is around 140 million. 130 million, 140 million. And here we have 40 million manuscripts. And this is the punchline. This is the killer. 95% of these have not been translated. So I repeat the question. If we do not know what exists, then how do we know whether there's something of value or not? Let me take a proposition. All of us are concerned with the legal system and the delays of the legal system. As civil cases, these are the 17 most important civil cases that must be tried in order of priority. And what is number 1 on that list? Breach of contract. Who said this? The Ministry of Law and Justice hasn't exactly said it. This is Bhishma telling Yudhishthira when he is lying down on the bed of arrows and is instructing Yudhishthira in the course of Shanti Parva and Anushasana Parva. A rich person should not be, a rich person guilty of a crime should not be put in prison because that is at the cost of the public exchequer. A rich person should instead, once he's been convicted of a crime, be forced to pay a monetary penalty. You may not agree with that value judgment that is expressed, but it is not a value judgment expressed by the World Bank or the University of Chicago Law and Economics people. Where is this? This is again Bhishma teaching Yudhishthira. Does the average UPSC aspirant know this? I don't think so. And remember, there is a lot of knowledge that came down to us in the course of oral transmission. That's not there in the manuscripts. That's been completely lost. Whose responsibility is to ensure that that knowledge is not lost to posterity? Let me give you another example. As two extremes, I'm not suggesting for a minute that either of these two extremes exist in the world. But as two extremes, we have capitalism. I repeat, ideal capitalism does not exist anywhere in the world. But as an extreme, I have that ideal template of capitalism where every decision is taken by the market. As another extreme, which also does not exist, I have ideal socialism where every decision is taken by the state. We, in terms of governance, had a template. And that template had dharma as in duties for the king or the state, dharma as in duties for individuals, and dharma as duties for communities. So it is a template that is completely distinct, that is somewhat distinct from the two templates I've described. Does this template resonate with the civil service aspirant? Probably not, because we think of governance and everyone will mention Arthashastra. Arthashastra was a manuscript that had been lost until Professor Shama Shastri rediscovered it in 1905 and translated it. I'm certain that the average UPSC aspirant does not know that there are at least another 10 texts that go by the names of Arthashastra. There are several texts that talk about governance. Do you know that there is a manuscript that goes back to the 13th century, untranslated, at least in English? It's called Chodya Shastram. As the name implies, Chodya Shastram is a manual for thieves. If this were to be translated, it would run into 450 pages. A printed volume on what thieves should do. So all of this, first let us read them before we dismiss them. And I'm not even getting into mathematics and astronomy and medicine. Before we say it's valueless. If we start with the proposition that they are valueless, we will realize they have value only when someone from Oxford or Cambridge or Heidelberg comes to us and says, hey, look, we found this as value.
Okay. Talking about NITI Aayog, you were a member of the NITI Aayog since its inception for almost 5 years. And it's been almost 6 years that the NITI Aayog was started. So do you think that NITI Aayog has contributed to the development goals of the nation? And if yes, then how? How do we quantify the success of NITI Aayog?
It's a good question, but I will not answer that question. And I'll tell you very clearly why I will not answer that question. The reason is that I'm still associated with the government, but I'm not a member of NITI Aayog anymore. Had you asked me that question while I was a member of NITI Aayog, I would have answered that question. But today, since I'm not a member of NITI Aayog, but I continue to be part of government, I should not answer that question.
Okay. Moving on to the next big aspect that you have been in the news for the past 4 years is the high-powered committee to restructure the railways. Now, while you were chairing that committee, how difficult or easy the task of reforming railways did you find? Do you think it's a very monumental task and it can be achieved in 10-20 years, or you think that the timelines could be shorter to implement those reforms that you suggested?
Changing the railway system is difficult. It's a time-consuming exercise because several of the things that have happened over decades. The present form of the railway board goes back to the year 1905. The railways after a fashion started in 1853. So obviously, if you have got something that has that kind of history, changing it is not an overnight process. One must also accept the obvious that railways has freight, railways has passengers. Quite often, when you look at people's expectations on the part of what the railway should do, this is passengers, not freight typically. The passengers who are articulating these beliefs are people like you and me, who will typically travel by Rajdhani. We will travel by Shatabdi. We will travel by express trains. We will certainly travel reserved. And we fail to recognize, so the people who normally have expectations on what the railway should deliver are people who travel in these kinds of trains. As I said, the Rajdhani, the Shatabdi, the air-conditioned trains, the express trains, please do realize that 95% of passengers on Indian railways still travel unreserved. So when one is talking about transforming the Indian railways, it is not only about, it should not be only about high-speed trains and trains that travel at 170 kilometers per hour and more than that, but also about the broader category of passengers. The expectations of passengers should not be only that when will I have railway stations that resemble the railway stations of the West? When will I have railway stations that look a bit like airports? Now that's important, but I'm just pointing out that the canvas for the Indian railways is a broader one. It includes freight also. Having said this, there have been many committees on railways in the past. I think what distinguished our committee from other railway committees is that most railway committees, by the way, go abroad on study tours to understand how railways work in other countries. Ours is the only railway committee that did not travel abroad to study what is happening in other countries. Ours is the only railway committee where members only traveled by train. None of them traveled by air, except for Mr. Chandrasekhar, who happened to be based in Thiruvananthapuram, and logistics from Thiruvananthapuram is not very easy. Otherwise, all of our members travel by train. Our members traveled everywhere and met roughly 2/3 of the DRMs that exist in the railway system. They met roughly 50% of the station masters. They met all the GMs. The net result was the suggestions that we put forward in our committee report were actually suggestions that came from people who work from the railways themselves. We internalized them and had a conceptual structure. It made our committee report probably a bit closer to reality compared to other committee reports. If you look at any of the committee reports, there is no great disagreement about where the railway should be 20 years from now. More or less all of them agree. But what is important, not only where the railway should be 20 years from now, but the process of moving from here to that ideal goal 20 years down the line. Having said that, there were five major pillars in our set of recommendations. So let me quickly state those pillars. One was competition through private entry. Competition through private entry is slightly different from actually privatization in the sense of selling of equity of existing railway enterprises. Private entry. This is not a binary that I switch, I put a switch on and everything happens tomorrow. It's an incremental process even on private entry. On private entry, we can get into the details if we have time. Several initiatives have already happened. Private entry of services, cleaning of stations, catering, now private trains, first on the freight side, now on the passenger side. So this was the first plan. The second plan was decentralization of decision making. Because down the years, the railways had become very centralized and many decisions unnecessarily had to be taken, had to be referred up to Rail Bhavan, to the Railway Board. And the railways today, before the reforms, were much more centralized than the railways ever were in the 1950s. So we argued for decentralization to GMs, train superintendents, DRMs, pruning the railway board, revamping the number of people who work in Rail Bhavan. Again, it's not a binary, but incrementally several of those things have happened. The third pillar was HR, revamping HR. In any organization, unless you do something about HR, unless you do something about finances, the organization cannot be revamped. So HR also has many dimensions, including what I said about the railway board. There is the unification of services because the railways work in silos. Of course, unification of services is a little bit complicated because it is easier for prospective entrants, people who are entering through UPSC, let us say, and retrofitting that in retrospectively with the present railway, present staff. That's a bit more. So here also don't look on it as a binary. Things have happened. Fourth was we wanted a developer. We called it a regulator because the regulator has to ensure that the rules of competition are followed. The railways now calls it a development authority. The development authority is work in progress. It's still not been set up, but it will soon be set up. The fifth one that we mentioned was a switch to commercial accounting. Today, railways accounts are such that I don't quite know what is profitable, what is not profitable. This, one must accept that the railways as part of the government system has to conform to the norms set by CAG. So when I'm saying transition to commercial accounting, it's actually two sets of accounts simultaneously. One to adhere to the CAG's requirements, the other one on a commercial basis. This have already been done on pilot basis, first in Ajmer division, then in North Zone, and it is in a state of rollout for the entire railway system. So therefore, yes, reforming the railways was difficult, but also because we went into implementation, because we talked to so many railway people, including the unions, I believe, without any sense of ego, that is the first railway committee which has led to changes actually being made, not in the form of binaries, but as incremental changes. And therefore, you will see the changes soon. You will soon see the things that people like us are more interested in. You will soon see railway stations, not a large number, there are 8,000 railway stations, not all of them at one go. You will soon see stations, at least 8 stations, give it another 2 years, that resemble airports. You will soon see trains that travel at 200 kilometers per hour. You will soon see the railways have already made that announcement that all trains will become air conditioned, etc. etc.
So at the Palkhiwala Memorial Lecture in 2019, You had mentioned that there is a need to take a relook at the entire constitution. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I can. The bedrock of all our laws is the Constitution of India. That sets the basic structure. Courts have ruled that the basic structure of the Constitution cannot be changed. But subject to that, the Constitution has gone through several amendments since it first came into effect in 1950. There were debates in the Constituent Assembly about the shape the Constitution should take, and in 1950 we had a Constitution. There have been several amendments since then. While speaking in the Constituent Assembly debates on the issue of inserting the word socialism in the Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar said, the Constitution has to be dynamic. The Constitution has to reflect the will of the people, which today it is reflected through Parliament. And therefore, we will not put in a word like socialism into the Constitution. This is Dr. Ambedkar. I know it is part of the preamble now, but this was Dr. Ambedkar, because the Constitution has to reflect the changes. Today, we should ask ourselves, and let me take that socialism as an example. Today, we should ask ourselves, do we want the Constitution as it is? Do we want certain schedules in the Constitution which are outside the scrutiny of the judiciary? Do we want the word socialism, which of course is in the preamble, but as a result of that, under the Representation of People's Act, every political party in India has to pledge that it is a socialist party. How can I pledge that unless I don't know what the word socialism means? So in the light of the fact that young India is now questioning not the words, but the implications of words like democracy. Don't misunderstand. I'm not questioning democracy. I'm questioning the working of democracy, the working of parliament, the working of judiciary, socialism. All of these things, we should take a relook at the Constitution. Do remember that when judges ruled that the basic structure of the Constitution cannot be changed, the ratio was 7-6. In other words, 6 judges thought the Constitution should be changed. The basic structure should be changed. So only 1 judge effectively decided that the basic structure of the Constitution should not be changed and determined our future in a way. But let that pass. As societies change, I believe, and I can go item by item, I believe we should take a relook at the Constitution. There was, as all of you know, a committee that was set up to examine the Constitution. I personally think, I have a great deal of respect for the judge, for the Supreme Court, ex-Supreme Court judge who chaired it, but I do believe that it did not look at the substantive parts.
And those substantive parts would be, if you can briefly tell us.
It's a long list. Come on, we are talking about the Constitution. I can say Article 311, I can say Article 39C. It's a long list. I can mention the 10th schedule, the 11th schedule, the 6th schedule, the 7th schedule. You see, look, you are civil service aspirants, so some of you are. How did we get the Constitution? Well, essentially, we got the Constitution on the basis of the Government of India Act of 1935. The Government of India Act of 1935 essentially determined many of the contours of the Constitution, including union-state relationships. The Government of India's Act 1935 was largely influenced by the Government of India Act of 1990. And 1919 as civil service aspirants, is the Morley Minto reforms. So in the year 2020, which is 100 years after the Morley Minto reforms, should we not question the edifice? Should we not ask from the point of view of governance, is the present structure of the 7th schedule, which divides responsibilities into a union list, a state list, and a concurrent list, the right one? Should we not ask, since most public goods and services are delivered by local bodies, beyond the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, should not there be a local body list in the 7th schedule? Should we not ask whether there should be a concurrent list? Should we not ask whether police should move to the union list? Etc., etc. I can go on and on, but the 7th schedule is one obvious example because you provoked me.
Okay. I just wanted to know a couple of areas where, a relook would be the most urgent.
You are civil services aspirants. Some of you will join the civil services. You will agree while you are still an aspirant, you will agree that if someone does not perform, I should get rid of the person. While you are an aspirant, you will agree. Once you have succeeded, you may not agree. But once you have succeeded, Article 311 makes it impossible for me to get rid of you. So should I not ask whether Article 311 is good and desirable from the point of view of efficiency and rewarding merit?
Okay. My next question, again, I do not know whether you are at the liberty to answer or not, sir, but I have to ask it. As the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the PM, what has been the one most important piece of advice that you have given to the government during the COVID-19 crisis?
I will partly answer the question and partly also not answer it for a reason that I will explain. We are an Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. We are not an Economic Advisory Council to the government. The government has its own chief economic advisor, who, although is based in finance ministry, is technically an advisor to government. We are an economic advisory council to the Prime Minister, which therefore means that whatever advice we give is for the Prime Minister, it's not for public consumption. It does not come out into the public domain. That's not our mandate. That is for others to do. Since it is an economic advisory council to the Prime Minister, it has to be important enough to be escalated to the level of the Prime Minister. So if it is nitty-gritty of this tax rate, that tax rate, we would not look at it because that is for finance ministry to look at. This is for the Prime Minister, so it has to be sufficiently escalated. COVID, like other countries in the world, caught all of us unawares. So therefore, and this is a federal country, not in a legal sense. In a strictly legal sense, this is not a federation, but everyone refers to it as a federation, so let me ignore that. This is a disaster. It's an epidemic, but it's a disaster. Ask yourselves the following question. When there is a disaster, should there be an uniform template throughout the country or should there not be? As the Economic Advisory Council, we feel that despite federalism, there should be a uniform template throughout the country. I don't know how many of you are aware, you should be aware, that the registration of deaths is compulsory in India. You probably know that. There is a 1969 piece of legislation under which births and deaths have to be registered. I do not know how many of you know as UPSC aspirants that the track record on registering deaths varies enormously across states. It varies enormously. despite the fact that there are penalties for not registering deaths. States don't enforce. We're talking about COVID deaths, right? So if the basic death data are not good, it stands to reason that the COVID death data also won't be good. One part is deaths. Second part is what causes deaths. That's the second part. If you look at the report on medical causes of death, you will see that the performance is even worse. So death registration is worse, is bad, causes of death is even worse. So I have an entire question mark about the quality of death statistics independent of COVID. As a country, shouldn't we have a standard template? Shouldn't we have a standard template for testing protocols? Yes, the ICMR has guidelines, but states do essentially what they will. Should there not be a standard template for lockdown? We have a National Disaster Management Act under which every district is supposed to have its own disaster plan. How many districts have their disaster plans? Very few. Today it is COVID, tomorrow it may be another disaster. A question was asked in Parliament yesterday, day before yesterday, on data on migrants. There is an Interstate Migrant Workers Act of 1979 which would have required mandatory registration of migrants. Have states enforced it? No, they have not. So we have flagged several things to the Prime Minister broadly under the template of governance, broadly under the, I'm not getting into specifics, broadly under the template of the health sector, broadly under the template of public expenditure and the re-switching of public expenditure. That's all I'm going to say, no specifics.
Okay. My next question to you is, as an economist, what do you think will be the year by which India will achieve its target of the $5 trillion economy goal? Obviously, the goalpost has been shifted, but how far ahead do you think that it has shifted?
That's an impossible question to answer, and I'll tell you the reason. When I look at a 5 trillion target, that target is in dollars, which means to get to that target, I will have to make some assumptions, and it's not only a dollar target, it's a nominal target. So I will have to make assumptions about the inflation rate, and I will have to make assumptions about the exchange rate, both. Before COVID hit us, depending your assumptions about the exchange rate, behavior of the exchange rate might be different from my assumptions about the exchange rate, inflation rate, etc. With reasonable assumptions, you would have got a real rate of growth of about 8.5%. With your assumptions slightly different, we would have required at least 8%. So to get to a 5 trillion target, in that prescribed time frame, I would have required, in that prescribed time frame of 24-25, I have required an 8% real growth. In growth rate terms, we still do not know the impact of COVID and the lockdown. The lockdown will pass. COVID, as we understand it, will pass, but it will leave mortality and morbidity for individuals. It will leave mortality and morbidity also for enterprise. And the next 2019-20, because of these reasons, as you know from the newspapers, will have negative real growth. And the next year, 2021-22, will only be recovery. So at the beginning of 2022-23, we will be roughly where we were at the end of 2019-20. One way of looking at it is 2 years down the lane. So we begin this 5 trillion exercise afresh from 2022-23. I'm not ducking the question. I'm just explaining why it is so very difficult to answer the question. Once we have a better understanding of how deep the impact of COVID has been and the legacy it has left, we will have a better sense of 2020 to 23, what kind of real growth rate we have. Once we have that, if it is 5%, then the timeline shifts. If it is 6.5%, I can be a bit more optimistic. If you put a gun at my head and said, give me an answer, which because of reasons I said you should not, but if you had to hold a gun at my head, I would say that target with reasonable assumptions now seems very unlikely before about 2028.
Okay. So all I wanted was just a rough estimate, and you have given us that. Definitely 2 years will be recovery, and 28 can be the year by which we achieve that target. So my last question is regarding the GST regime. We have seen that recently the GST imbroglio involving the states and the center was there. So there are two parts to my question. Part one is, how do we make the GST regime better? And the second is, do you agree with the fact that there needs to be one tax slab instead of the multiple ones right now?
GST or any tax reform requires standardization, simplification. Just a small fact before I answer the question. GST was supposed to replace all the other taxes. And it was supposed to be revenue neutral. Revenue neutral means what? It yields the same amount of revenue as the earlier tax system did. Calculations showed that the average GST rate to be revenue neutral should have been about 17%, around 17%. Otherwise, you lose revenue, and losing revenue means union government loses revenue, states also lose revenue. What is the average rate today? 11.5%. So, purely on the basis of the rates, the present GST structure is not desirable. The average rate should have been 17%, it's 11.5%. All of us will happily argue as citizens, 28% rate should be reduced, 18% rate should be reduced. But by the same token, if you're going to have standardization and simplification, the 0% must also increase, the 5% must also increase. You cannot have one without the other. As an economist, whatever be the tax, except direct taxes, which inherently are supposed to be progressive, whether it is import duties or indirect taxes like GST, I would argue for one single rate. I've said it when GST was announced. Despite being within government, I was criticized by people from within government. But I, as an economist, believe that there should be a single GST rate for everything. Very few countries in the world have GST. Many countries have VAT, but a proper GST, not too many countries have. Most countries which have VAT oblique GST, despite the idea of a single rate, have essentially gravitated towards three rates. A standard rate, a merit rate which is lower, and a luxury rate which is higher. So although as an economist, I would prefer a single rate, I'm prepared to accept that because of the reality, we'll probably have three rates. But certainly, hopefully, not the present, more complicated structure that we have.
So that would be the end of my questions for you today, and we are very much thankful that you took out time from your busy schedule and gave us the time and the opportunity to speak to you. I'm sure that the insights that you have provided will be very much helpful to all our viewers, especially the UPSC aspirants. And with that, we would like to thank you and the viewers and end this session.
Thank you.